Hello YouTube, this is Jacob and welcome back to the Christian Perspectives 2004 YouTube channel, and in today's video we are going to be talking about Islam's Jesus dilemma. I have been doing a lot more research and have fallen down the rabbit hole of looking into the Islamic view of Jesus, and ultimately I'm sure other Christians and historians and theologians have made similar videos and books and other things like this before, so I'm sure the Islamic Jesus dilemma is nothing new. But here is my version of Islam's Jesus dilemma. So here's my first point: sinlessness versus prophet hierarchy. Muhammad admitted he and other prophets were human and could sin. Islam claims Jesus, or as they call Isa, is uniquely sinless. But here's a logical problem. If sinlessness defines ultimate authority, shouldn't Jesus be the seal of the prophets, not Muhammad? And Muhammad taught only Allah is fully sinless. Attributing sinlessness to Jesus creates a theological and logical tension. If Islam were true and Allah really cared about His word being brought as accurately as possible, wouldn't He have Jesus be the seal of the prophets? Because according to Islam, according to Muhammad, according to the Quran, Jesus is sinless. So wouldn't it then make sense for the sinless Jesus, who the Quran even refers to as Messiah, to be the seal of the prophets? Why would Muhammad be the seal of the prophets? Someone that would be lesser than Jesus. Here's my next point: Jesus' role. According to Islamic teachings, Jesus will return near the end times. He is not coming as a new prophet, but to defeat the false prophet, the Dajjal or Antichrist figure, uphold the quote-unquote truth of Islam, and bring peace and justice. Muslims believe Jesus' return confirms Muhammad's teachings and completes God's plan. However, there will be an interaction between the Mahdi and Jesus. And the Mahdi, for those of you who don't know, in Islam is not necessarily a prophet, but a divinely guided leader that his mission is to unite all of the Muslims in the world together. However, I can do a whole nother video on how the Mahdi destroys Islam's claim of Muhammad being the seal of the prophets, because technically the Mahdi would actually fall under the realm of being a prophet and not necessarily being, we're all divinely guided, but with the specific job that the Mahdi has, it sounds almost like an end times version of John the Baptizer. So you see a bit of a prophet-like realm around the Mahdi. But let's get back on track. The Mahdi is to be a divinely inspired figure that appears before Jesus that unites all Muslims around the world. The Mahdi acts as a preparatory leader, setting the stage. Jesus' return is the climactic event where ultimate justice is established. Some hadith suggest that Jesus will pray behind the Mahdi, symbolizing that he submits to Muhammad's final law, reinforcing the idea that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. Okay. But we have a problem. So notice these last 2 points. Islam believes that Jesus will return at the end of time, and he will affirm Muhammad's teachings and complete the plan of Allah, and that Jesus will pray behind the Mahdi. We have a bit of a problem here. What is that problem? Well, Jesus, according to Muhammad, is sinless. So we have a bit of a hierarchy issue. Why would Jesus come to affirm what Muhammad taught? Remember, if you know anything about prophets, when you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, you know, and even when you look at the Quran, it talks about affirming the next prophet affirms the previous prophet. Never once does it talk about a previous prophet returning and affirming the prophet that came after him. So, why would Jesus need to affirm Muhammad? Why would Jesus, the sinless Jesus, need to affirm Muhammad as the seal of the prophets? And why would the sinless Jesus pray behind just an ordinary man, the Mahdi? Why would he do that? That doesn't make any logical, theological sense. Why would Jesus do that when in the hierarchy he should be at the tippity top? Because Muhammad admitted he was a sinner, and the Mahdi is a sinner. So why is Jesus affirming Muhammad? Why is he praying behind the Mahdi? That's a problem, a hierarchy problem, and a major problem and contradiction that the Quran has regarding prophethood. Again, most Muslims would agree that prophets that come after another prophet is to affirm the previous prophet. But yet Muslims believe that Jesus is going to come back and affirm Muhammad, which clearly breaks the prophetic cycle and is very, very confusing. And again, as I brought up before, if Allah really wanted his message to be conveyed clearly, wouldn't it make more sense for the sinless Jesus to be the seal of the prophets rather than Muhammad? And now we jump to another part of the dilemma with the Jesus dilemma within Islam. Islam attributes miracles to Jesus, raising the dead and forgiving sins. These acts are associated with God alone. If Jesus is only human performing divine acts, this creates a conceptual tension. So, when it comes to, and I'll give Muhammad a little bit of credit, one thing that he did get right about Jesus, he performed miracles. He was sinless. He raised the dead. He forgave sins. But Muhammad goes on to say many, many, many times that only Allah can do these things. Well, if only Allah can do these things, why is a mere prophet, according to Muhammad and Jesus, able to do these things? Why is he raising the dead? Why is he giving life? Why is he performing miracles? Why is he doing all the things that no other prophet has done? Not even Muhammad himself did. Why is he doing only things that Allah can do? There's a major, major consistency issue and creates a major conceptual tension. Because if Jesus is only human, but he's performing divine acts, then clearly, taken to its logical conclusion, Jesus would have to be more than a prophet. So now we have the next point, the hadith reliability issue, as it is in the hadiths in Islam, where you will get more information regarding the Islamic view of the return of Jesus. So prophecies of Jesus' return come mainly from hadith literature, not the Quran itself. There is no concrete historical evidence that Muhammad directly taught these details. The authenticity and reliability of these hadiths are debated, meaning that even though most Muslims do believe that Jesus will return, where they debate at is the reliability of the hadiths. So some Muslims may not even believe in the figure, the divinely led figure that will appear before the return of Jesus. Some may not believe in him, some may not, or some may believe in him, but they don't believe that Jesus will pray behind him. So, considering how we don't even know if Muhammad ever truly taught that Jesus was going to return, because remember, the Quran itself is silent on whether or not Jesus will return, and we know the Quran is a good idea of what Muhammad taught. Now, could one of the other two Qurans, because historically speaking, there were 3 Qurans and they all conflicted one another, could one of the other 2 Qurans contain a teaching of Muhammad that's found in the hadiths regarding the return of Jesus? It's very possible. But we will ultimately never know, because the other 2 Qurans were completely destroyed, and we just have simply no way of getting our hands on them now. Therefore, again, as I said, there's a hadith reliability issue, because the hadiths were written hundreds of years after Muhammad's death, and with the hadiths being written hundreds of years after Muhammad's death, it creates an authenticity issue on, are these things really what Muhammad taught? Or are these just fabrications that later Muslims made up, like regarding Jesus' return, when they were confronted with major theological problems, when we Christians would bring up the prophecy of Revelation and the return of Jesus, and Muslims felt the need to come up with their own version of the return of Jesus that would fit within Islam and the teachings of Muhammad in the Quran. But ultimately, we don't know. We have no idea of knowing, because, the hadiths could be more external teachings from Muhammad, outside of the Quran, but it may not be. But there's just too many reliability issues with the hadiths, which creates even more of a dilemma for Islam regarding Jesus, and if Muhammad even taught if Jesus would return or not. And as mentioned here, when I talked about the Mahdi in Jesus, and then Jesus' return affirming Muhammad as the seal of the prophets, there's a major dilemma there. As I said, why would Jesus, the sinless Jesus, pray behind a mortal man in the Mahdi? And why would Jesus, who is sinless, affirm a sinner in Muhammad? And as I mentioned earlier, if Islam was true, why wouldn't Allah have Jesus be the seal of the prophets? So now we have logical hierarchy problem that I've alluded to a little bit earlier. Sinless and moral purification, imply authority. Jesus is sinless, yet Muhammad is the final prophet, seal of the prophets. Islam places a human leader above a sinless prophet, creating an internal inconsistency. As I mentioned at the very beginning, and as I mentioned mere moments ago, Jesus is sinless. That's something Muhammad taught. However, according to Islam, Muhammad is the final prophet, the seal of the prophets, which creates a hierarchy problem. Islam places a human leader above a sinless prophet, creating internal inconsistency. And if the hadiths are really external teachings from Muhammad, then his teachings regarding the return of Jesus is also another form of this hierarchy problem with the Islamic prophets, because again, why would the sinless Jesus submit to the sinner that is Muhammad? It creates a major hierarchy issue, and as I said before, and I'll say it again before the video's over, if Islam were true, why wouldn't Allah have Jesus be the seal of the prophets? Now we have the theological problem of sinlessness within Islam. Sinlessness is a divine attribute in Islam. Claiming Jesus is sinless risks blurring the distinction between God and human implicity, elevating him. You see, Muslims believe that us Christians, by worshiping Jesus, that we are the followers of the biggest idol worship in human history. But yet they fail to realize, if Islam were to be true, then Allah would be responsible for the false worship by allowing Jesus to be sinless. By Jesus being sinless, and by Jesus doing all the things that only Allah can do, it logically makes us humans believe that Jesus is more than a prophet, and that Jesus is God himself. So, if Islam were true, then it would be Allah's fault that people worship Jesus as God, and not the fault of us Christians. 'Christians. 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 that Jesus is sinless within Islam risks blurring the distinction between God and human implicity. And now we have voluntary submission versus authority. Islamic explanations suggest, this is going back to Jesus and the Mahada, suggests that Jesus' submission to the Mahada is voluntarily. Even so, though, a sinless, divinely appointed figure submitting to a lesser human is theologically problematic. Plus, for those of you who don't know, Islam's view of when Jesus returns, he will reign upon an earthly throne over the world, imposing Islamic law for the rest of his life, eventually dying a natural death and returning to heaven. And the problem that we run into, if Jesus is to be this king-like figure in Islam when he returns, like the hadiths claim, why would Jesus pray to the Mahada? Why? Shouldn't the Mahada bow before Jesus? Shouldn't the Mahada affirm Jesus? Shouldn't Muhammad affirm Jesus? Why would Jesus affirm Muhammad if Jesus is going to be the one reigning as a king? Why would Jesus affirm Muhammad or the Mahada if Jesus is the one who is sinless? It creates a problem again within the hierarchy. You can claim that Jesus would do it voluntarily, but that still creates a theological problem with the hierarchy of Islamic prophets. A major problem. And now we have historical and logical resolution, and that is in Christianity. Jesus, as God incarnate, solves all tensions. Sinlessness and not anomalous. Now, what do I mean by that? Jesus being sinless does not create some dilemma in Christianity like it does Islam. Rather, Jesus being sinless supports the message that Christianity is given, and Jesus' authority is absolute. No human hierarchy problem arises. Miracles and forgiving sins are coherent, and death and resurrection are central and historically attested. You see, I'm going to bring this in here in a moment, but let me make this clear first. Jesus as God incarnate solves all of the dilemmas of Jesus in Islam. Jesus being sinless tells us he is God, because Muhammad said only Allah is sinless, but he claims Jesus is sinless at the same time. He claims that Jesus raised the dead, that he gave the blind sight, that he did all these wonderful things that he goes on to say only Allah can do. But yet Jesus did them. And it creates a hierarchy issue between Jesus and Allah himself. Whereas when you look at the historical Jesus, the Christian Jesus, you don't have this problem. Jesus is God incarnate, and his authority is absolute. There is no human hierarchy problem. And the miracles that Jesus performs, the forgiveness of sins that Jesus gives, makes far more sense within the Gospels than they do within any of Muhammad's teachings in the Quran. And then you have the nail in the coffin the death and resurrection of Jesus. Muhammad rejects the death of Jesus. He rejects the resurrection of Jesus. But there's a clear fundamental flaw in that, and that is the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most certain first century history events to take place, along with the resurrection. There are historically verifiable documents outside of the Bible, and then the Gospels themselves being historically reliable documents that clearly showcase that it was Jesus on the cross, that it was Jesus laid into the tomb, and that it was Jesus that was raised from the dead on the third day and appeared for over a 40-day period to hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and many people began worshiping Jesus as God. Notice how no one in that time ever said, oh, he's a prophet, or oh, it's a mass illusion, because Muhammad claims in the Quran that the apostles knew Jesus was saved from the cross. However, history and the Gospels tell us a different story, that the apostles knew Jesus was crucified, that he did die, and that they then saw him raised from the dead on the third day, proving his divinity, proving to be God, proving to be far more than a prophet. And you don't believe me? Go do your historical research. Muslims, go do your research. And you will find that the resurrection of Jesus is one of the most sure things in history. And the resurrection of Jesus and the entire ministry of Jesus counteracts everything Muhammad taught. Jesus taught that he is God in human form. Jesus taught forgiveness for sins. Jesus performed miracles. He gave life to the dead. Jesus preached peace, love, acceptance, and hope. But here comes Muhammad 6 to 7 centuries later, who never met Christ or anyone that knew Christ, and comes up with some bogus story without ever reading the Bible for himself, and claimed that he loved Jesus, and claimed that he viewed Jesus in a high regard, yet everything that he did contradicted the teachings of Jesus, including teaching that Jesus was just a prophet, including teaching that Jesus was not crucified or resurrected, and teaching things like kill the infidel, something that Jesus would firmly be against. And then this also brings in the crucifixion dilemma. Jesus foretold his death and resurrection. However, Islam rejects his death and resurrection. Therefore, if Islam were to be speaking the truth regarding Jesus, then according to Islam, Jesus would be a false prophet, which makes Islam false. But if Jesus told the truth, and that he was crucified and died and rose from the dead, then that means Muhammad's a liar and Islam is false. So either way, whether Islam is supposedly correct about Jesus being a prophet, but then he foretold his death and resurrection and it didn't happen, then Islam's false. But if Jesus spoke the truth, then Islam's false, because then that proves Jesus to be God. And it also showcases that Jesus did something that Muhammad said he didn't do. And Muhammad is supposed to be the seal of the prophets. So, you see the major crucifixion dilemma, which plays perfectly into the Jesus dilemma that Islam has. And now, some of you Muslims may be asking, well, doesn't the Apostle John or the Prophet John with Revelation, does that destroy any arguments that I make? Does he undermine Jesus? And the simple answer is no, he doesn't. John is a human prophet who records visions in the book of Revelation. There is no hierarchy problem. John is subordinate to Jesus. The prophecy does not stop with John. It's an ongoing prophecy that does not challenge Jesus' divinity. Contrast with Islamic scenario where a human Mahdi could seemingly outrank the sinless Jesus. So notice something. There is no cap. There is no seal to the prophets in Christianity. Now, is the prophet John the last prophet that we Christians can say undisputedly was a prophet? Yes. But has there likely been more prophets of God foretelling the return of Jesus like John did in Revelation? And will we continue to see more and more and more and more and more until Jesus ultimately returns? Yes. Who these people are, we don't know. But we know that they exist. And who knows? You yourself watching the video could be one of the end time prophets of God. I don't know. But you notice with the prophet John, again, there is no hierarchy problem. John is subordinate to Jesus. John is a human prophet, whereas Jesus is God himself. And the prophecy, as I said, does not stop with John, and it's an ongoing prophecy that does not challenge Jesus' divinity, to where ultimately the way you can tell if, say, you meet someone that sounds very wise and is talking a lot about the end times and the return of Jesus, ultimately the way you can test to see whether or not they are a prophet from God would be using basically the checklist that the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy gives you to test whether or not someone's a reliable prophet or not, which just so happens Muhammad fails that test, whereas the prophet John passes that test. And if someone you meet passes that test, then they are a prophet from God, and they are not contradicting Jesus or any prophet that came before them. Rather, they are affirming what the prophet John taught, and they are affirming Jesus' divinity and Jesus as God. So there is no hierarchy issue or dilemma within this, whereas within Islam, a human in the Mahdi could seemingly outrank the sinless Jesus. So here's the takeaway points. I know this is a long video and it's been kind of all over the place, but this is something that I really wanted to talk about. Islam's depiction of Jesus creates historical, logical, and theological tensions. Christianity's teaching of Jesus as God incarnate resolves these issues. Human prophets like the Apostle John complement Jesus' ministry without competing with his authority. So in conclusion, Muslims, wake up. Muhammad was a liar. The Quran, the Hadiths, they're not reliable. Jesus is God. Your own book secretly says it. I like to call it the God Die Pact. I don't remember if it's David Wood or Testify Apologetics who called it that, but I'm going to use it here. The God Die Pact. I truly believe that God implemented thoughts into Muhammad's head when he was teaching his followers that would ultimately be written down in the Quran that would serve as a die pact in the Quran, proving the unreliability and the contradictory nature of the Quran. Read the Quran. The Quran tells you that Jesus is God. Muhammad may say over and over and over, Jesus is not God. Yet when you read about the stories of Jesus in the Quran, he is clearly showcased to be God. So that's what I call God's die pact in the Quran. So, wake up, Muslims. Wake up. Jesus loves you. He's reaching out to you. He wants a relationship with you. Don't continue being led astray by this caravan robber in Muhammad, who's burning in hell right now, and rightfully so. Follow Jesus. Follow Jesus and accept him as your Lord and your God, and receive the salvation for your sins. God bless you all, and thank you for watching.